The night before I buried my son, his wife stood in my hallway and told me to get out of my own house. Not during an argument, not in grief, calmly, like she had practiced the sentence beforehand and finally found the moment she believed she had earned the right to say it. The house was full that night, church members carrying casserole dishes into my kitchen, neighbors speaking in lowered voices beside Raymond's old piano, men Oleander grew up with standing near the back patio pretending to discuss football because nobody wanted to say the real thing out loud yet. My son was lying in a casket across town at Henley's funeral home on Cascade Road. Tomorrow, we were supposed to bury him. That night, I was standing in the hallway of the home I had owned for 31 years, listening to his widow tell me I no longer belonged inside it. She did not whisper. That part matters. People who know they are wrong usually lower their voices automatically. Berlin didn't. She looked directly at me with her chin lifted slightly and delivered the words in a soft, almost pleasant tone that disturbed me more than shouting would have. "Everything goes to me now," she said. "My children never want to see you again." Then she paused just long enough for the sentence to settle where she intended it to land. Leave. Not emotional. Prepared. That was what stayed with me afterward. Prepared. I looked at her standing there beneath the light fixture Raymond installed himself 22 years ago after insisting the original one made the hallway feel cold. Then I looked beyond her at the walls I had repainted 4 separate times across 3 decades. The floors my husband laid plank by plank while Oleander chased a basketball through the unfinished rooms wearing socks on bare plywood. 9 years earlier, when Oleander brought Berlin home, I welcomed her without reservation. Truly welcomed her. I never searched her background, never measured her usefulness, never questioned her intentions. I simply trusted my son. And slowly, year after year, Breland settled into my house the way certain people settle into comfort, until comfort begins convincing them it created itself around them. The cream drapes in the front room disappeared in year 2 because she said they looked outdated. The dining room furniture shifted positions every few months. One summer, she had the landscaping stones near the garden walkway rearranged without even mentioning it first. Tiny things. But tiny things reveal ownership fantasies long before big things do. By the time Oleander got sick, she moved through that mansion with the unconscious confidence of someone who no longer understood the difference between living somewhere and building it. I said nothing after she finished speaking. Not because I was shocked, because I suddenly understood something very clearly. Braylon had been waiting for death longer than the rest of us had. I stepped around her and started toward the staircase. Behind me, I heard plates clinking softly in the kitchen and distant voices from the living room where people were still mourning my son honestly, while his wife stood in the hallway rehearsing inheritance. Before I go further, if you're listening right now, tell me what time it is where you are. I always wonder who sits awake with stories like this in the middle of the night. My name is Livonia Ardell. I am 63 years old. My husband built this house for me when our son was 3. Since then, I have buried one parent, then another, then Raymond himself. And I have learned something important about survival. Quiet people notice everything. I walked upstairs and down the hallway into Oleander's childhood bedroom. The room still smelled faintly like cedar wood and old books, because some spaces hold on to earlier versions of your life long after the people inside them become adults. I sat on the edge of the bed in darkness with my hands folded in my lap. I did not cry. I had already done that privately in hospital parking garages and locked bathrooms, and once in my pantry holding a box of cereal, because grief does not care where it arrives. What sat inside me now was not grief anymore. It was clarity. And sometime between sitting down on that bed and hearing Breland laugh softly downstairs with one of the church women, I made a decision that changed everything which followed. Not about leaving. I was never leaving anything that belonged to me. 18 months before the funeral, Oleander sat at my kitchen table and told me he was dying. Not dramatically, not with the kind of collapse people perform in movies. He said it quietly, with both hands wrapped around a mug he had forgotten to drink from, his eyes fixed somewhere near the grain of the wood instead of on my face. The oncologist was direct today, he said. I don't have the kind they can outrun. He was 40 years old. The cancer had moved fast, faster than anyone expected, including the doctors who kept using words like aggressive and advanced in careful professional voices that still could not soften what those words actually meant. Renly was there that afternoon. She had come by earlier with groceries and never left, which is how Renly loves people. Quietly, permanently. She stood at the counter refilling Oleander's water glass after he spoke. And when I looked at her, she held my eyes for exactly 1 second, long enough to say, I heard it too. Nobody rushed to fill the silence after that. Some silences are not empty. Some are carrying the full weight of a life-changing shape in real time. After a while, Oleander started talking about his children. Not legal arrangements yet, not documents, just the children themselves. Soleil was 8 then. He said she had started noticing moods too quickly, walking into rooms and adjusting herself before anybody spoke. He laughed softly once and said she read tension the way some children read books. Proud of her for it. Afraid for her because of it too. Then he talked about Cassius. He laughs from his stomach, Oleander said, like he doesn't know the world can take things yet. That smile he gave when he said it almost broke me more than the diagnosis had. Then came Cleo, barely 2 years old, still climbing into his lap sideways because she had not mastered balance completely. He said every time he came home from treatment, she wrapped both arms around his neck so tightly it sometimes hurt to breathe. She knows something's wrong, he said quietly. Kids always know. Neither of us cried. We were not that kind of family with each other. We grieved privately, separately, like people trying not to hand each other additional weight. Then, eventually, the conversation shifted. Not suddenly, slowly, the way difficult truths usually arrive. Oleander stared into his coffee for a long time before he spoke again. I've been carrying the whole marriage by myself for years, he said. There was no bitterness in it. That was the part that stayed with me. He sounded tired, more than angry. He told me he had tried, gently at first, then directly, to encourage Breland towards something of her own. Work, school, a business, anything that gave her structure outside of him. He said every conversation somehow dissolved before becoming real. She always says she's figuring things out, he said quietly. But years keep passing. Then he admitted something else. Toward the end of his treatments, he had started handling all the household finances separately because things inside the house had become unpredictable in ways he could not fully explain. Small things at first. Missed school emails. Grocery money disappearing faster than it should. Days where Breland slept until noon and moved through the house, distracted and unreachable afterward. She says it's stress, he told me. Maybe it is. I honestly don't know anymore. That was the moment I understood he was frightened about more than dying. He updated everything quietly after that. The will, the life insurance, the investment accounts. Every financial instrument he controlled was redirected into a trust for Soleil, Cassius, and Cleo exclusively. He explained it to me without drama, sitting at my kitchen table like a man discussing weather instead of mortality. I just need to know the children are protected no matter what happens. I understood everything underneath that sentence. That evening before he left, he recorded a message for his children on my phone. Just his voice talking about who he had been before they knew him as sick. The music he loved. The mistakes he made. The kind of people he hoped they would become after he was gone. After he left, I sat alone in my kitchen and played it once. Just once. Then I placed the phone face down on the table because hearing my son prepare his children for a world without him was something I could survive exactly one time that night. I have attended funerals where grief filled the room so completely there was no air left for anything else. Oleander's was not that kind of funeral. Not because people did not love him, but because one person in that room was already standing in the future while the rest of us were still trying to survive the present. Brelin wore black the way some women wear an announcement. The dress was fitted. The hat angled carefully enough to look effortless. She moved through the church receiving condolences with a measured softness that never quite reached her eyes. I watched her touch hands and lower her voice and lean into embraces she did not feel. And somewhere between the second hymn and the final prayer, I understood something with complete clarity. She thought this was over. I sat in the front pew where a mother belongs, and I did not collapse. I had already done that privately in the months before the funeral. In grocery store parking lots after oncology appointments. In my shower with the water loud enough to hide the sound. In Oleander's childhood room after midnight with his old basketball trophies staring back at me from the shelves. There are people who grieve publicly and people who survive privately. I have always been the second kind. The service itself was beautiful. The pastor spoke with restraint instead of performance. 3 of Oleander's colleagues stood and said true things about him, not polished things, real things. One spoke about how Oleander quietly paid for an employee's wife to finish cancer treatment 3 years earlier and never told anyone in the company. Another described him driving across the city during a storm because one of his junior staff members was stranded with a flat tire and too embarrassed to ask for help. I held every word carefully. At the graveside, I watched Brelin rest her hand against the casket for exactly long enough for a woman from the church to lift her phone. Then she stepped back. I looked away before the picture was taken. After the burial, Renly had the driver bring the car around. I returned to the mansion one final time before sunset. The house was crowded when we arrived. Casseroles on the kitchen counter, low voices in every room, people trying to help grief by feeding it. By the time I went upstairs, most of them had started leaving. I moved through the house with purpose. Oleander's watch sat on the dresser beside the bed. The same watch Raymond gave him when he got his first executive promotion. The clasp was worn smooth from daily use. I slipped it carefully into my purse. In the front room, there was a framed Christmas photograph from 2 years earlier. Soleil smiling without self-consciousness yet. Cassius laughing so hard his body blurred slightly in the image. Cleo asleep against her father's shoulder. I took that too. Then I opened the kitchen cabinet and removed one of my mother's dishes. White porcelain with a faded blue rim. Older than the marriage. Older than the house itself. 3 things. Not because they were the only things that mattered. Because they were the only things I needed. When I came downstairs, Renly was waiting near the entrance hall with my bag already in her hand. She studied my face for one moment and nodded once. Outside, the car engine started. Inside, Brelin stood halfway down the staircase with one hand resting lightly on the railing. Watching. Not grieving. Watching. Neither of us spoke. Some conversations finish themselves long before silence arrives. I walked past her and through the front door and into the evening air without looking back. That was the last time anyone saw me for almost 2 weeks. I did not answer calls. Church members left voicemails asking if I was staying with family. Neighbors told each other I had gone away to recover. One woman told Renly she heard I was selling the house because the grief was too much to carry inside it. Berlin heard all of it, and she believed every word. By the fourth day, she had already started changing things. The security codes, the flowers near the front entrance, the staff schedule. By the end of the first week, she was giving instructions in my house with the calm confidence of a woman who thought the final witness had finally removed herself from the room. She believed grief had made me disappear. She did not understand that disappearance and surrender are not the same thing. While Breland stood in the entrance hall imagining herself untouchable, Attorney Mercer was already preparing the first document that would begin taking her entire world apart. The painters arrived on a Tuesday morning, 6 days after we buried Oleander. Renly called me that evening and told me the master bedroom was being repainted charcoal gray. She delivered the information the way she delivers everything important, flatly, without emotional decoration, leaving me room to understand the weight myself. I thanked her. Then I sat alone in the condo living room for several minutes after the call ended, staring at the city lights beyond the balcony glass. 6 days. That was how long Breland waited before beginning to rearrange my house around herself. By the end of the first week, the security codes had been changed. Not just the main entrance, the side gate, garage entry, and wine cellar access, too. One of the housekeepers Renly knew from church mentioned quietly that Berlin had started referring to the property as the estate now when speaking to vendors. Not the house. Not Livonia's house. The estate. That language shift unsettled me more than the paint did, because people reveal what they believe they own long before lawyers ever enter the room. 2 framed pieces disappeared from the main hallway that same week. Raymond's oil painting from the year we married, and the photograph of my mother's church choir from 1987. Renly said the walls looked strange afterward, pale rectangular shadows left behind where the frames had hung for decades. Breland replaced neither piece, just empty space. The absence itself felt deliberate somehow. She had also started spending more freely from the marital operating accounts Oleander maintained for household expenses, furniture consultations, landscaping estimates. A designer from Buckhead walking room to room with fabric books under her arm. Not irrational spending, exactly. Premature spending. Breland believed several insurance and estate distributions were still moving through probate processing. She also believed the house itself would eventually become part of those transitions, because during the entire marriage, Oleander handled nearly every major financial structure personally. That part, at least, was true. Oleander inherited Raymond's instinct for compartmentalization, taxes, trusts, renewals, property filings. He handled all of it through attorneys and accountants long before illness entered the picture. Breland had lived inside comfort for years, without ever needing to examine the scaffolding underneath it. Comfort can make people mistake stability for ownership if they stay inside it long enough. Renly visited twice that week. Berlin tolerated her presence because refusing a great-aunt access to grieving children that soon after a funeral would attract exactly the kind of church attention she did not want. Berlin understood appearances too well to make a mistake that public. So Renly sat quietly in the kitchen and watched. And every evening she called me afterward. Not gossip. Observation. Soleil had gone unusually quiet, not withdrawn exactly. Alert, watching every room before entering it, tracking moods automatically the way some children track weather changes. Cassius had become louder instead of quieter. Constant movement, constant noise, the kind anxious children make when silence has started feeling unsafe. And Cleo followed Breland everywhere, room to room, doorway to doorway. Like a child unconsciously checking whether the adult she depended on was emotionally present or drifting somewhere unreachable again. According to Renly, Breland only noticed about half the time. One afternoon, Renly arrived while two decorators were walking through the downstairs, discussing countertops and paint finishes. Berlin stood near the foyer, answering questions distractedly, while Cleo sat alone on the staircase, holding a juice cup with both hands, watching her mother from 6 feet away. Renly said Cleo never once asked to be picked up. That detail bothered me all night. Children stop asking for things when asking stops feeling dependable. The second week after the funeral, Breland invited a few people from church and two of Oleander's colleagues over one evening after the children had gone upstairs. Nothing loud, no party. Just catered food in warming trays and low music through the downstairs speakers while people sat on the patio talking softly about new chapters and moving forward. One neighbor later mentioned hearing Berlin laughing briefly when someone complimented the renovations and said the house already felt lighter. The house, not the home. The house. I listened carefully to everything Renly told me across those 2 weeks. Then I drove downtown to Attorney Mercer's office and sat across from him while evening traffic crawled beneath the windows behind his desk. He opened a folder already waiting on the table before I arrived. Inside was the formal occupancy notice, market rate tenancy terms, 30-day compliance window. Vacate language already reviewed carefully for enforceability under Georgia property law. I signed the authorization without asking a single question. Not because I was angry, because by then I understood something clearly. Berlin had mistaken silence for surrender. And the next morning, a process server was going to begin correcting that misunderstanding formally. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning 14 days after the funeral. Certified mail. Breland had to sign for it at the door, her own name written carefully across a line beneath the address of a house she had already begun thinking of as permanently hers. The return address belonged to a law office on Peachtree Street. She carried the envelope into the kitchen without urgency, set it beside her coffee cup, and finished half the cup before opening it. She was not nervous. At that point, she was still expecting normal estate paperwork. Insurance processing, probate correspondence, administrative delays tied to Oleander's death, the kind of legal movement wealthy families deal with quietly after funerals. More importantly, she was waiting for the insurance confirmation. In her mind, the payout already existed. She had mentally assigned portions of it toward household stabilization, legal expenses, the remaining balances in the marital accounts, and maintaining control of the property while probate sorted itself out. She opened the envelope cleanly, the way people open documents they believe they already understand. She read the first paragraph, then stopped, then read it again from the beginning. It was a formal occupancy and rent demand notice, her name at the top, the mansion's address beneath it, then the number. A monthly occupancy rate calculated from the documented market value of a $25 million Atlanta property. Not exaggerated, not emotional. Precisely itemized with property references, payment terms, compliance language, and statutory notice requirements attached beneath it. It did not read like a threat. That was what unsettled her most. Threats contain emotion. This contained structure. There was a payment schedule, a 30-day compliance window, a formal vacate clause triggered automatically upon non-payment. At the bottom sat the signature of an attorney she did not recognize. Breland set the papers down slowly on the kitchen counter, then picked them back up. The numbers did not change. The language did not soften. The 30-day clock printed near the bottom remained exactly where it was. What she felt first was disbelief. The specific disbelief of someone encountering something that should not logically exist, and therefore deciding it must be administrative error, a clerical mistake, an incorrect filing, something one phone call would resolve before lunch. Then came the second feeling. Not fear yet. Destabilization. Because the notice contained details impossible to dismiss casually. Parcel references, occupancy language, county filing citations, market rate calculations tied to actual valuation reports. Real paperwork has a particular weight to it. People feel it before they fully understand it. She still did not know the notice had been drafted before Oleander was buried. She did not know the night she stood in the hallway and told Livonia to leave had changed nothing structurally. The attorney had already been retained. The documents had already been prepared. The delivery delay had been procedural, not emotional. Her words that night had not triggered revenge. They had simply confirmed Livonia's decision. Breland stood in the kitchen of a house she had already started repainting and reorganizing, and looked down at a number the remaining marital accounts could not realistically sustain, not monthly, not while legal fees accumulated, not while waiting for estate distributions still tied up in review. She opened the banking app on her phone, then the household account, then the secondary account Oleander used for operating expenses. For the first time since the funeral, she actually looked carefully at the balances instead of assuming future money would close the gap automatically. That was the moment the floor shifted underneath her psychologically. Not because the accounts were empty, because they suddenly looked temporary. The realization came quietly. The insurance funds had not arrived. The probate process had not finished. The house was legally someone else's. And the amount listed in that notice was large enough that even wealthy people do not casually absorb it for long without certainty attached to future income. Her breathing changed slightly. Nothing dramatic, just slower, more deliberate. She reached for her phone with the confidence of a woman still trying to convince herself this was solvable through explanation. Some misunderstanding, some missing conversation, some attorney who had moved too aggressively without the full picture. She had no idea she was making the first call of a legal collapse that had already been structured carefully around her weeks earlier. The first person Breland called was an attorney. Not Attorney Mercer yet. A probate attorney one of her church friends had used years earlier during an estate dispute involving her father's property. Breland explained the rent notice calmly at first. The certified envelope, the 30-day deadline, the law office on Peachtree Street. She spoke with the confidence of someone describing an administrative mistake she expected professionals to correct before lunch. The attorney listened quietly. Then he asked one question. "Is your name on the deed?" The silence afterward changed the shape of the conversation immediately. Breland said she didn't know. Not evasively. Honestly. That honesty revealed more than defensiveness would have. For 9 years, Oleander had handled nearly every major financial structure personally. Taxes, insurance renewals, trust paperwork after Raymond died, household accounts. The property itself had never carried a mortgage during Breland's marriage because Raymond paid it off years before his death. Nothing about the house ever required Breland's signature directly. She had lived inside the outcome of financial systems without ever participating much in their construction. The attorney told her he needed to verify ownership before discussing strategy further. By mid-morning, his paralegal had already pulled county records. The Atlanta property, house, land, guest structures, surrounding acreage, belonged solely to Livonia Ardell. It always had, not jointly, not inherited through Oleander, not transferred after Raymond's death. Livonia alone. The attorney called Breland back less than an hour later. "The property has never been marital property," he explained carefully. "Legally speaking, your occupancy existed through family permission rather than ownership interest." That sentence landed harder than the rent notice itself. Because until then, Breland still believed this was a technical conflict, a misunderstanding, a temporary legal pressure tactic, something widow status and attorneys could eventually correct. Now, the foundation underneath her assumptions had disappeared completely. She called David next, one of Oleander's senior colleagues from the company, a man who had known him more than a decade. Breland hoped there might be executive assets or corporate protections she did not fully understand yet. David was polite, careful, and absolutely useless to her. He confirmed only what she already knew. Oleander intentionally separated business structures from family life long before he got sick. Beyond that, David said nothing. Then Breland called a woman from church whose husband worked in luxury real estate. That conversation ended even faster. By early afternoon, she finally asked directly about the insurance policies. That was when the second collapse arrived. The probate attorney requested preliminary estate documentation tied to the active filings. What came back was devastatingly clean. Life insurance beneficiaries: Soleil Ardell, Cassius Ardell, Cleo Ardell. Investment trust beneficiaries: Soleil, Cassius, Cleo. Education accounts, retirement structures, transfer on death accounts. Everything redirected 18 months earlier into protected trust structures managed for the children. Not Breland, not jointly. No automatic widow transfer provisions. Nothing. The attorney explained carefully that she could still potentially pursue portions of marital assets through probate proceedings. But probate litigation is slow even when families cooperate. Months at minimum. Sometimes longer than a year. Nothing about probate timing could stop a 30-day occupancy demand. Then came the part that truly frightened her. The attorney advised her not to spend aggressively from the remaining joint accounts until the estate accounting process clarified exactly what funds remained marital versus trust protected. That was the first moment Breland understood the numbers in those accounts were not entirely stable either. Legal retainers had already started draining money. Household expenses continued daily. And the redesign consultations she began after the funeral suddenly looked reckless instead of manageable. That afternoon, Breland finally understood the scale of what Oleander had done quietly before dying. He had not left chaos behind accidentally. He had built structures deliberately, not vindictively, carefully. That distinction mattered. Vindictive people leave explosions. Oleander left paperwork. Renly noticed the psychological shift during her next visit almost immediately. The confidence had cracked. Not publicly yet, but privately. The decorators stopped coming. One landscaping consultation was canceled midway through the week. Fabric samples disappeared from the downstairs tables. Breland started spending long stretches upstairs alone with folders spread across the bed, while the children moved quietly through the house beneath her. Late that night, she searched Attorney Mercer's law firm online. Real estate litigation, protective trusts, asset preservation, probate disputes. She stared at the screen long enough for the phone to dim in her hand. That was the moment the situation finally became real to her. Not emotionally, structurally. 9 years inside a $25 million house. No ownership, no guaranteed access to wealth, no immediate insurance proceeds, no legal leverage strong enough to stop what was already moving toward her. Just 30 days. And a woman she had badly underestimated waiting somewhere outside the house, in complete silence. Breland called my phone 4 times before I answered. I let her choose the words. She said she needed to see me and that it could not wait, and that what was happening was not acceptable. I told her I could meet her Thursday at 11 at a restaurant on Peachtree, a place I chose, a table I reserved, a room I was already comfortable in before she arrived. She said fine. She said it the way people say fine when they mean something else entirely. I was there first. I ordered water and sat with my hands on the table and watched the door. She came in moving fast, the specific pace of a woman who has been rehearsing a conversation in her head for days. and is afraid that slowing down will cause her to lose the thread of it. She was dressed for confrontation in the way people dress when they want to appear unbothered and have not quite managed it. She sat down across from me and did not take off her coat. She started talking before she was fully seated. The rent notice was harassment. It was retaliation. She was Oleander's widow, and she had rights, and she had been living in that house for 9 years. And what I was doing was cruel, and she would not accept it, and she had an attorney, and she was prepared to go to court and make this very public and very difficult for everyone involved. I let her finish. Then I said, "There are 3 options. You pay the monthly rate as stated in the notice. You have your attorney contact mine to discuss a modified arrangement. Or you vacate within the remaining window." I folded my hands. Those are the options. She told me I could not do this, that the house was Oleander's home, that her children had grown up in it. "The deed has never been in Oleander's name," I said. "It has never been in yours. That is not a new fact. It is simply one you are learning late." Her jaw tightened. She said she was going to court. She said her attorney would bury the notice and establish her right to remain in that property as a surviving dependent, and I would spend the next 2 years in litigation. I nodded. "That is your right. Attorney Mercer already has your attorney's contact information." She stopped. The shift was immediate and visible, a stillness that moved through her face, the way cold moves through a room when a window opens. I had used her attorney's name, not the firm, not the office, the name, without her having mentioned it once across this entire conversation. She understood then what that meant. Not that I had done research, that this had been organized long before she found the envelope on her kitchen counter, long before the funeral, long before she stood in my hallway and told me to leave my own home. She had spent 3 weeks believing she was reacting to something I had done in grief and anger. She had never been ahead of this. Not once. She started to say something else. I could see it forming. The next argument. The next angle. I picked up my bag. I left enough on the table to cover the water. I stood, straightened my jacket, and walked toward the door at the pace of a woman who has somewhere else to be, and has already given this meeting everything it required. She was still talking when I reached the door. I did not turn around. Renly called me on a Tuesday evening and did not say hello first. She said, "Soleil told me something today, and I need you to hear it exactly the way she said it." That sentence alone made me sit down. Renly had been visiting the mansion regularly since the funeral, not intrusively, carefully. Familiar enough that Braylon no longer treated her presence as something requiring constant attention. By then, the legal fight had consumed so much of Braylon's energy that anything looking harmless was allowed to remain harmless. Renly arrived that Tuesday afternoon carrying groceries and a coloring book for Cleo. Soleil answered the door. Renly told me the first thing she noticed was how quietly the house held itself now. No television noise, no music, no movement upstairs. Just the low hum of the refrigerator and Soleil sitting at the kitchen counter with watered-down juice beside her homework. They talked casually for a while. School, lunch. Whether Cassius was still obsessed with dinosaurs this week or had gone back to superheroes again. Then Soleil opened the refrigerator to get Cleo something to eat and said, without any change in expression, "I already made her lunch earlier because Mommy wasn't up yet." Renly kept her face still. "What did you make?" she asked. "A peanut butter sandwich and crackers," Soleil said. "We ran out of fruit cups yesterday." Then she shrugged slightly and added, "I do it a lot now." That was the sentence that stayed with me after Renly repeated the conversation word for word. Not dramatic, not frightened, routine. Children only speak that calmly about burdens they have already accepted as normal. Renly stayed another hour after that, long enough to watch the shape of the house more carefully. Breland eventually came downstairs near 4 o'clock wearing sweatpants and one of Oleander's old college hoodies. She apologized for oversleeping and blamed a migraine. Renly said her speech was clear, but delayed somehow, like someone thinking through fog half a second slower than the room around her. That detail landed harder than the lunch did, because it connected too neatly to things Oleander had hinted at months earlier. The missed school emails, the late mornings, the drifting attention, the unreachable feeling he could never quite define. Renly also noticed the refrigerator again before she left. There was food in the house, but not the kind that suggested anybody was planning meals with 3 children in mind. Takeout containers, half-empty juice, crackers, bread, a few things that could be assembled quickly by whoever noticed hunger first. That mattered. Not because poverty had entered the house. It had not. Because neglect does not always arrive through empty cabinets. Sometimes it arrives through no adult consistently paying attention to what should happen next. While Renly was leaving, Cleo wrapped both arms around her wrist and pressed her face against Renly's arm, hard enough that Renly had to gently pry herself loose. Not tantrum behavior, attachment behavior. Children reach differently when they are uncertain which adults will remain emotionally available from one day to the next. After we hung up, I sat alone in my condo for almost an hour without turning on a single light. I thought about Soleil standing in that kitchen making lunch for her little sister while her mother slept upstairs. I thought about Oleander staring into his coffee cup 18 months earlier when he admitted things inside that house had become unpredictable. Mostly, I thought about timing, the eviction pressure, the legal notices, the financial collapse. Whatever private instability Breland had managed to keep partially contained before Oleander died was no longer staying contained now. And the children were beginning to absorb the impact in visible, ordinary ways. Not bruises, not screaming. The quieter kind of damage. Missed mornings, unplanned meals, hypervigilance, a 9-year-old adapting herself to instability before she was old enough to understand what instability even was. That night, I pulled out a yellow legal pad from my desk drawer and wrote down only what I could verify. Dates Renly had visited. Specific statements she repeated. School absences already mentioned. Behavior changes observed more than once. No guesses. No dramatic language, just facts. Not because I wanted a fight, because if those children needed help, feelings would not be enough to protect them. Family court does not move on heartbreak. It moves on patterns. The next morning before 8 o'clock, I called my attorney and told him the property dispute was no longer the only matter requiring preparation. He went silent for a moment before asking one question. Are you telling me you believe the children may no longer be adequately supervised? I looked down at the legal pad in front of me. Then I answered carefully. I'm telling you a 9-year-old has started parenting a toddler often enough that she thinks it's normal. The 2 words written at the top of my legal pad were custody petition. I did not file it impulsively. My attorney spent almost 2 weeks building it properly because family court judges do not respond well to grieving grandparents arriving with suspicion and emotion. They respond to patterns, documentation, verifiable concern. So we documented carefully Renly's observations across multiple visits, school attendance records, specific behavioral changes in the children, exact statements Soleil made written down the same day they were spoken. Nothing exaggerated, nothing speculative. Before filing, my attorney also advised attempting one additional procedural step first. A written request offering voluntary family support services and parenting evaluation without immediate court escalation. Attorney Mercer declined on Berlin's behalf 3 days later. That mattered legally. By the time the petition was finally filed, it was no longer an emotional complaint from a grieving grandmother. It was a documented request for welfare review after failed attempts at informal intervention. The first hearing came just over 3 weeks later because juvenile family review calendars in Fulton County move faster when minor children and active housing instability overlap. Family courtrooms are smaller than people imagine. Quieter, too. No dramatic speeches, no pacing attorneys. Just fluorescent lighting, old carpet, tired clerks, and families trying not to collapse publicly. Breland arrived with Attorney Mercer 10 minutes early. She looked composed at first glance, expensively composed. But by then, I had learned the difference between calm and strain held tightly together. Her stillness looked managed now instead of natural. Attorney Mercer argued first. She was good. She framed the custody petition as retaliatory escalation connected to the property dispute. A grieving widow under extreme pressure from simultaneous legal proceedings, initiated shortly after her husband's death, temporary school disruptions, emotional instability in recently bereaved children, nothing unusual, nothing requiring state intervention. Then she made her strongest point. No allegations of physical abuse, she told the court. No allegations of substance abuse. No allegations of abandonment. What we have is grief complicated by ongoing litigation and housing uncertainty. The judge listened carefully. He even nodded once. That worried me more than hostility would have. Then my attorney stood. No theatrics. No emotional performance. Just documents. First, the property deed establishing the housing dispute as legally separate from custody concerns. Then, school attendance records. 6 absences for Cassius within 5 weeks. No medical documentation. Multiple unexcused tardies. No parent communication on several dates. Then Renly's written observations entered chronologically instead of emotionally. Repeated oversleeping. Children preparing meals independently. Inconsistent morning supervision. Behavioral withdrawal. Heightened attachment behavior from the youngest child. Then finally, Soleil's statement. I do it a lot now. My attorney did not overplay it. That was what made it effective. Attorney Mercer objected immediately to any DFCS involvement. She argued the evidence reflected temporary grief disruption, not neglect severe enough to justify state review. Honestly, part of her argument was reasonable. The judge acknowledged that directly. Then he asked a question neither attorney seemed fully prepared for. Has the respondent agreed voluntarily to support services or parenting evaluation at this time? Attorney Mercer glanced toward Breland. Breland answered before her attorney could. No, she said flatly. That changed the room. Not dramatically, subtly, because cooperation matters heavily in family court, especially early. The judge leaned back in his chair and reviewed the file again for almost a full minute before speaking. Then he granted limited review. Not a neglect finding, not emergency removal, not temporary custody transfer. A court-authorized welfare evaluation through Georgia DFCS based on documented concerns requiring further assessment before custody proceedings could continue. Narrow, procedural, realistic. The follow-up review hearing was scheduled approximately 6 weeks later pending the DFCS report, guardian recommendations, and any additional school documentation gathered during that period. Court adjourned. Outside in the hallway, people moved around us carrying folders and coffee cups and crying quietly into phones. Family court hallways always feel like several lives unraveling simultaneously beneath fluorescent lighting. Breland stopped beside me near the elevator. She did not look directly at me when she spoke. This is still about the house, she said quietly. You're trying to punish me because I won't leave quietly. I studied her face for a moment. The exhaustion underneath the makeup had become impossible to fully hide by then. But what stayed with me most was that she still genuinely believed the custody matter was strategy instead of concern. She thought I was escalating a property war. She still did not understand the truth. The eviction was about ownership. The custody petition was about the children surviving the instability growing around them. The DFCS intake review would be processed within 10 business days. As Breland walked toward the parking garage beside Attorney Mercer, she looked relieved. Not victorious. Just relieved. Like someone who believed the worst part had finally passed. She had no idea the state had only just entered the room. The caseworker arrived on a Wednesday morning without calling ahead. That is standard practice. An unannounced visit is the only kind that tells you anything true about a household. By the time a family knows someone is coming, they have had time to arrange the surfaces. What you learn from a Wednesday morning without warning is what Wednesday morning actually looks like. Breland answered the door in a robe. She recovered quickly, invited the caseworker in, excused herself to change, returned within 4 minutes in clean clothes with her hair pulled back. Composed. Cooperative. The caseworker noted all of it, including the recovery time. The front rooms presented well. The furniture Breland had chosen across 9 years of decorating someone else's home held up under a first glance. Good pieces, well placed. The repainted walls clean and deliberate. A visitor arriving for a social call would have seen a well-appointed home in a period of transition. The caseworker was not a social call. The kitchen was a different room entirely. The refrigerator held condiments, 2 takeout containers from different restaurants, a half-empty bottle of orange juice, and nothing that suggested a meal had been prepared inside that kitchen in several days. The sink held dishes stacked in the way. Dishes are stacked when they have been there long enough that adding to the stack has become easier than addressing it. The counter held 3 unopened pieces of mail and a prescription bottle that the caseworker photographed without comment. The children's rooms were clean. That was the first thing visible, and it was real. The beds made, the floors clear, clothes put away. But there was an impersonal quality to the neatness that had no warmth underneath it. No book left open. No drawing half-finished on a desk. The rooms of children who had learned to keep things tidy, because tidy was one less thing that caused a problem. Soleil sat at the kitchen counter during the caseworker's visit and watched everything. Not shyly, not with the visible distress of a child in crisis, with the specific attentive stillness of a child who has been reading adult behavior for long enough that it has become automatic. The caseworker asked her easy questions. Soleil answered all of them directly and without embellishment, and the caseworker noted in her file that the child's effect was appropriate, but her vigilance was not consistent with her age. Cassius was at school. His attendance record had been requested as part of the evaluation. 6 absences in the past month, each one undocumented, no medical notes, no parent communication to the school. The record spoke without requiring interpretation. Cleo was home. She came into the kitchen midway through the visit, found a stranger at the counter, and climbed into the caseworker's lap without hesitation. She stayed there for the remainder of the visit. The caseworker let her. Children who go readily to unfamiliar adults are often children for whom familiar adults have been inconsistently available. The caseworker had seen it before, and she knew what she was seeing now. Breland answered every question articulately. She explained the school absences as a response to Cassius's grief, a judgment call she had made as his mother during an extraordinarily difficult period. She explained the kitchen as a temporary adjustment while she managed the estate and the legal proceedings. She maintained eye contact and kept her voice steady and sat with her hands folded in her lap in the specific way of someone who has decided exactly how they want to appear and is concentrating on appearing that way. The caseworker had seen that composure before. It was the composure that tried too hard and landed just slightly wrong. Not enough to name in conversation, more than enough to document in a report. The report was filed 4 days later. It did not recommend emergency removal. It documented concern, Household stability flagged. Supervision patterns noted. School absences requiring immediate address. Open custody case referenced. Monitoring recommended pending court review. The judge received it on a Friday afternoon. I was not in the room when Soleil was interviewed. That is standard practice, and I was grateful for it. I would not have been able to sit across from my granddaughter and listen to what she had to say without letting her see something in my face that a 9-year-old should not have to manage. The guardian ad litem met with her privately at a neutral office, a room designed to feel ordinary, with low furniture and soft colors and nothing that announced itself as official. Soleil went in alone. She sat down. She answered what she was asked. The guardian ad litem shared a summary with my attorney, who shared it with me that same afternoon. I am going to tell you what it said. Soleil described mornings. She said that before her father got sick, mornings had a particular feeling. Her father up first, the smell of coffee, the sound of the television on low while everyone got ready. She said after he died, the mornings changed. She described what they looked like now, without any frame around it. She said her mother was often still asleep when she needed to leave for school. She said she made sure Cassius had his bag and that Cleo had eaten something before she left. She said she had been doing it for a while. She described evenings. She said her mother was home most evenings, but that home and present were not always the same thing. She said she had learned to call her name twice before expecting an answer. She said she had stopped asking for help with homework after a while because in a minute had stopped meaning anything with a fixed end. She described one night specifically. She said Cleo had cried for a long time and she had waited because she thought her mother would come. Nobody came. She got up herself and went to Cleo's room and stayed until Cleo fell back asleep. She said she did not remember what time it was. She said it had happened more than once. She did not say her mother was a bad person. She did not use words like neglect or harm or any word that indicated she understood the clinical weight of what she was describing. She spoke the way children speak when they have already absorbed something into their ordinary understanding of how life works. Then she said, she did not blame her mother. She said her mother was sad, and that sad people sometimes went somewhere inside themselves that was hard to reach. She said she missed her father because when he was alive, nobody had to go unreached. She said she wished someone would help her mother because something was wrong with her, and it had been wrong for a while. Then she said she was tired of being the one who noticed. The guardian ad litem's summary ended there. I sat with the document in my hands for a long time. I did not read it again. Once was enough to know every word of it for the rest of my life. My attorney called that evening to discuss next steps. I told him I would call him in the morning. I needed the night first. Renly arrived at my door at 7 o'clock without calling ahead. She came in and went to the kitchen and put the kettle on and sat down at the table. She did not ask me how I was. She did not say anything that required a response. She already knew. We sat together in the kitchen the way we have sat together our entire lives, through things too large for words and too real to leave alone. Neither of us needed to say anything that night. We already knew what came next. Breland's motion to establish temporary residency rights was denied on a Tuesday morning. Attorney Mercer argued it well. 9 years of continuous residence. 3 minor children enrolled in nearby schools. A grieving widow facing displacement while an active custody matter remained unresolved. She requested temporary occupancy pending final family court review, framing forced relocation as destabilizing to the children during an already fragile period. The judge listened carefully. Then he reviewed the deed. My name only. He reviewed the unpaid occupancy notices attached to the filing. Then the DFCS report. Then the guardian ad litem summary already entered into family court record. When he finally spoke, his tone remained procedural. Temporary residency was denied. But the court did not order immediate removal the way television stories pretend judges do. Instead, Breland was granted a 14-day voluntary vacate period before formal dispossessory enforcement could proceed through the sheriff's office if necessary. Legally standard. Measured. Difficult to challenge successfully. My attorney called me afterward. Same calm voice he used for everything. "The court denied temporary occupancy," he said. 14-day compliance period begins today." I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat quietly in the furnished condo I had been staying in since the funeral and looked out at the city for a long time without moving. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just inevitability finally arriving where it had always been headed. Breland had no financial structure capable of absorbing what came next quickly enough. That was the reality underneath everything else. 9 years inside Oleander's life had given her comfort, access, and familiarity, but not independent infrastructure of her own. No current employment history strong enough to secure immediate luxury housing. No stable income independent of the estate process. No accessible liquid funds large enough to sustain 3 children, legal retainers, temporary housing, and an ongoing custody review simultaneously. A woman from church eventually offered her a furnished basement suite 20 minutes outside the city. Breland accepted. She moved out gradually across the next 10 days while Attorney Mercer continued negotiating extensions behind the scenes that my attorney refused politely each time. Renly stayed present during most of the move because the children were still inside that house, and somebody emotionally stable needed to remain nearby while their world changed shape again. What Renly described to me later stayed with me longer than I expected. Breland did not scream, did not break things, did not perform outrage for the neighbors. She packed quietly. The children's belongings first. School uniforms folded carefully. Medication bottles separated into labeled bags. Cleo's stuffed rabbit placed alone in a box so it would not disappear accidentally. Soleil's books stacked by subject instead of size, because apparently that was how Soleil preferred organizing them. Only after the children's things were packed did Breland touch anything belonging to herself. That detail unsettled me more than anger would have, because cruel people are easier to understand emotionally than overwhelmed ones. 3 days before the vacate deadline expired, Attorney Mercer filed an emergency motion in family court requesting temporary delay of any custody transition until Breland secured stable, long-term housing and completed the initial parenting support recommendations already discussed during review proceedings. That was the first strategically strong move she had made in weeks. The judge denied immediate delay, but also declined automatic placement transfer. Instead, he ordered a temporary placement hearing within 72 hours after relocation, specifically so the court could evaluate the children's stability after the housing transition occurred. That distinction mattered legally. Family court moves carefully when biological parents remain actively involved and compliant. The hearing itself lasted less than an hour. The court reviewed the active custody petition, DFCS findings, school attendance records, housing instability, Breland's temporary living arrangement, and the guardian ad litem recommendations already on file. The judge issued temporary primary placement with me pending continued review and additional monitoring over the following months. Temporary, not permanent, not termination. That realism mattered to me more than winning quickly ever could. The children arrived 4 days later. Renly drove them herself. I stood at the front door before the car even turned into the driveway, hands folded loosely in front of me. Face calm. The way you hold yourself when children are watching closely for signs that the adults around them are safe. The engine stopped. The back door opened. Soleil stepped out first with a backpack over one shoulder. Alert eyes already scanning the house, the yard, my face. Always assessing, always preparing herself before entering a room. Cassius climbed out slower. He looked exhausted in the particular way children look, exhausted after trying to behave correctly for too many weeks in a row. Then Cleo appeared. She stood beside the car, clutching that stuffed rabbit against her chest with both arms. She looked up at me with complete seriousness, studying my face like she was trying to answer a question nobody had explained properly yet. I stepped aside and opened the door wider. Not one of those children hesitated before walking inside. The final custody hearing was scheduled for a Monday morning at 9 o'clock. I arrived 20 minutes early with my attorney and sat quietly at our table while clerks moved files between courtrooms and families filled the hallway outside with nervous silence. Family court never feels dramatic when you are inside it. It feels administrative, which is worse, because administrative decisions are the ones that stay attached to your life afterward. Breland arrived with Attorney Mercer 4 minutes before the hearing began. I did not turn fully toward her when she entered, but I felt the difference immediately. Months earlier, Breland had carried herself with the hard confidence of someone convinced reality would eventually reorganize itself around her desires. That certainty was gone now. What remained was effort. Visible effort. Attorney Mercer still looked composed, prepared, sharp. Breland looked exhausted beneath control. The judge entered. Everyone stood. Then the hearing began. Attorney Mercer presented first. And she fought harder than I expected, not emotionally, strategically. She acknowledged the CPS concerns directly instead of minimizing them. A smart move. Judges distrust attorneys who pretend documented problems do not exist. Instead, she reframed the issue entirely. A grieving mother, a destabilized household after catastrophic loss, temporary impairment, not permanent unfitness. Then she introduced something neither my attorney nor I expected fully. Breland had voluntarily enrolled in outpatient evaluation 2 weeks earlier without court order and had already begun attending counseling sessions. Attorney Mercer submitted attendance documentation immediately. That changed the hearing. Not enough to erase the record, but enough to create complexity. The judge spent several minutes reviewing the paperwork before allowing my attorney to continue. He did not react emotionally either. He simply adjusted. Then he presented our side carefully and methodically. Renly's observations across multiple visits, the attendance records, the DFCS report, the Guardian ad litem findings, Soleil's statements, Cleo's attachment behaviors, the documented supervision concerns. No exaggeration, no attack language, just pattern after pattern, placed into evidence quietly until the shape became impossible to ignore. Then came the part that shifted the room permanently. The judge asked Breland directly whether she disputed the substance of Soleil's statements. Not whether she loved her children, not whether she intended harm. The statements themselves. Breland looked down at the table for several seconds before answering. "No," she said softly. "Not completely." That honesty probably helped her more than denial would have, but it also ended any realistic path toward full immediate custody retention. The courtroom went very still after that. My attorney spoke last. "The petitioner is not requesting punishment," he said evenly. "She is requesting stability during a period where the respondent herself has now acknowledged struggling to maintain it consistently." One sentence. Nothing theatrical. Then he sat down. The judge reviewed his notes for almost 2 full minutes before speaking. I did not watch him. I watched Breland, because by then I understood something important about people. The moment they realize they are truly losing something important rarely looks dramatic. It looks quiet. Breland sat perfectly still with both hands folded too tightly together. Her shoulders remained straight, but the energy holding her upright looked thinner now, strained in a way that made her appear suddenly smaller than I had ever seen her. The judge finally ruled. Temporary primary physical custody would remain with me pending continued review. Not permanent termination. Not full removal. Primary placement. Breland would receive structured supervised visitation while continuing outpatient treatment and parenting review services already initiated voluntarily. The court acknowledged her recent compliance positively, but determined the children required demonstrated long-term stability before reunification expansion could be considered. 6-month review hearing scheduled. Continued monitoring ordered, measured, realistic, final enough to change lives anyway. The judge closed the file. Court adjourned. People stood, papers gathered, chairs shifted across the floor. I thanked my attorney quietly and collected my documents. When I turned toward the courtroom exit, I noticed Attorney Mercer leaning slightly toward Berlin, speaking in a low voice meant only for her. Berlin nodded once, without looking up. No anger, no breakdown. That was the saddest part, somehow. Outside, afternoon light stretched across the courthouse steps in long, pale lines. Renly waited across the street with the engine running exactly where she said she would be. I walked toward the car slowly. Halfway there, I heard the courthouse doors open again behind me. Breland emerged, alone. Attorney Mercer had already left through another exit. Breland stopped near the top of the steps and looked out at the parking lot like someone trying to remember where she had left her life before everything started collapsing. For 1 second, I almost turned back. Almost. Then I remembered Soleil making lunch for Cleo while standing on a kitchen chair because nobody else had gotten up yet. And I kept walking. 6 months after the custody hearing, the review came and went quietly. Breland had enrolled in the treatment program within 3 weeks of the ruling. She had attended consistently. The compliance was noted in the court record, and the supervised visitation arrangement was maintained unchanged. The judge satisfied with the direction, but not yet with the distance traveled. The custody arrangement remained with me pending the next review. My attorney called to confirm it. I thanked him and went back to what I had been doing. What I had been doing was living. The mansion had settled into something that felt, carefully, like home again. Not the home it was when Raymond was alive. Not the home it was when Oleander was a boy running these halls with no understanding yet of what they represented. A different version. Quieter in some ways. Fuller in others. Soleil had stopped watching the room every time she entered it. The vigilance that had aged her face beyond her 9 years was still there occasionally. It does not disappear overnight in a child who spent months being the one who noticed, but it visited less. She had started leaving books open on her desk again, half-finished drawings, the small evidence of a child beginning to trust that tomorrow will resemble today. Cassius laughed the way Oleander described, from somewhere unreasonably deep, the kind that turned heads. The anxiety that had been underneath it for months was gone. He had not missed a day of school in 8 weeks. Cleo had stopped following people from room to room with that particular desperate need. She followed me sometimes, but it was different now. The following of a child who wants to be near someone, not the following of a child who is afraid of what happens when they are not. Breland knocked on a Saturday afternoon in the 11th month. No attorney, no advance notice. She stood at the door in clothes that fit her differently than they used to, not smaller, just less constructed, as though she had stopped dressing for an audience. She asked if she could come in and speak to me privately. I looked at her for a moment. Then I stepped back and opened the door. She sat in the front room. I sat across from her. Her hands were still. Not the forced stillness of the woman who had sat across from me in courtrooms and restaurants concentrating on how she appeared. Simply still. The restless, managed energy that had defined her across every interaction I had ever had with her was absent in a way that was immediately visible and impossible to perform. She looked at me and she said it directly. I stood in your house the night before you buried your son, and I told you to leave. I said your grandchildren didn't want you. She paused. That was a lie. I said it to hurt you, and I knew it would, and I said it anyway. I am sorry for that specific thing. I know it doesn't change what followed. She did not reach for more than that. She did not list her hardships or explain her state of mind or ask me to weigh her suffering against mine. She said the specific true thing, and she stopped. I let the room hold it for a moment. Then I said, the consequences are what they are. I am not revisiting them. I kept my voice even. But the door is not permanently closed. Not for you, for those children. You complete the program. You demonstrate sustained stability. That is the path. Whether you walk it is your decision entirely. She nodded. She stood. She did not ask for more than what I had given her. The front door closed behind her. I stood in the entrance hall of my home. The floors Raymond laid, the walls I had held for 31 years, the house Oleander had trusted me to protect. And I felt something move through me that I had not felt since before the diagnosis. Not peace, not yet. The beginning of it. The legal proceedings closed on a Thursday with no ceremony. My attorney sent a letter confirming the final disposition of both matters. The civil eviction concluded, the custody arrangement formalized, the children's trust administered and intact. I read it once at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, and then I folded it and put it in the drawer where I keep documents that matter, and I sat for a while in the quiet of a house that had found its shape again. Then I got up and walked through it. I moved through each room the way you move through something you have held for a long time and want to feel clearly rather than just inhabit. The front sitting room with its original drapes, the ones I had put back the week after Brylin left, the cream ones Raymond chose that she had replaced in year 2 and that I had kept in the cedar closet for 9 years, without fully understanding why. The hallway where Raymond's oil painting hung again, and my mother's church photograph had been returned to the wall. The kitchen where the dish with the blue rim sat in, the cabinet where it had always belonged. The house was itself again. Not frozen, not a monument. Simply itself. I thought about Oleander. He had sat at this kitchen table 18 months before he died and told me he wanted to make sure the children were taken care of no matter what happened. He did not come to me with a file or a documented case or a strategy mapped across 15 steps. He came with a feeling he could not fully name and the quiet clarity to act on it anyway. He called an attorney. He updated his will. He directed every financial instrument he controlled into a trust for 3 children who did not yet know they would need it. He did all of it without accusation and without anger because he was not that kind of man. He trusted his instinct. He trusted his mother. That was the entirety of his plan, and it turned out to be enough. I thought about Brylin, not with anger, that had burned down to something much quieter months ago. I thought about what 9 years of taking without building actually costs a person. She had moved into a life that was entirely someone else's construction, and she had arranged herself inside it so completely that when it was gone, she had nothing underneath to stand on. Every move she made after the funeral, the repainting, the recoding, the declaration in the hallway, the counter-motions, the arguments she arrived at already losing, was a woman reaching for something she had never held and could not hold because ownership is not transferred by familiarity. You cannot inherit what was never yours through proximity alone. She had wanted to use this house as a weapon. She had stood in its entrance hall and believed that wanting it badly enough was the same as having a claim to it. What she never understood was that this house was never a prize. It was a foundation. Raymond built it. I held it. Oleander spent the last 18 months of his life making certain it could not be taken from his children. Not through confrontation, not through documentation, but through a trust in his mother that turned out to be the most durable legal instrument anyone brought into any room across this entire matter. Breland wanted to use it as a weapon. Oleander had already turned it into a shield. I walked to the window at the back of the house. Soleil was in the yard with her face turned toward the sun, her eyes closed, just standing in it. Cassius was running along the far edge of the garden for no reason anyone could name. The pure, purposeless running of a child who has remembered that his body belongs to him. Cleo was laughing at something only she could see, both hands pressed against her mouth the way she does when something delights her, past the point of containing it. I watched them, and I felt something move through me that had been absent since the morning Oleander told me he was not going to make it. Not because justice had been served, though it had. Not because I had won something, that was never the word for it. But because those 3 children were safe in the house their grandfather built, and their father protected, and I had done what my son trusted me to do. That trust was the last gift he gave me. I did not waste it.